Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to start the meeting. My name is David Spiegelhalter, and I'm chairing this meeting. I'm on the RSS COVID working group. And I should explain, this is the first of 4 meetings we're having with the idea of gathering a range of opinions so as to form the basis for the RSS's submission to the public inquiry, whenever that's actually going to be taking place. But we thought it was a really good time to get as wide a range of opinions as possible. We're not trying to come to a consensus today. We just genuinely want a diversity of opinions. So we've got a complicated meeting today, which is going to take, let's hope it all goes well. It's a bit of an experiment. I don't know, 16 speakers or whatever, both mixture of in-person and online. So this really is an experiment. And I'd like to really thank the RSS staff who have worked so hard to try to put this together. But please be patient that everything doesn't go utterly smoothly. But as I said, this is a trial. I just as part of an introduction, before we get to the sort of the main speakers, something that somebody reminded me of is that everything we're going to be talking about today about communication of statistics and data during COVID depends at its core on people collecting the data and making it available as raw data. And we must, that's not the subject of this meeting. There's going to be another meeting on statistical resources where this can be discussed in more detail. But it should go without saying that everything we're going to be talking about today depends on extraordinary work, whether it's the dashboard, the fantastic work on the dashboard, or ONS, or whoever's been putting the data up for us to download and play with and do things with. We're utterly in their debt. Okay, we've asked the speakers to address the list of questions. I'm not going to do them all, people will pick and choose, but, which I think you may have seen, roughly, number one, how effectively has everybody out there communicated with the public, and that's government representatives, data providers, the media, commentators, and we've got sort of an example of all of those here. How have different statistical definitions impacted how this information has been communicated, how well has uncertainty been communicated? I hope we're going to get a good chunk on that. How good have the visualizations been? Has the data been accessible for download? For example, as the APIs from the dashboard, has that improved public understanding and communication? Was enough done to try and prevent information becoming misinformation? And we left one out. And how do we lift this out? This is what I'm most concerned with. So I'm going to add one in. So there. And I'm going to ask it if nobody else, even if they don't deal with it. So the one I wish had gone in there, to what extent have communications been trying to inform people, and to what extent actually trying to persuade them to act or think in a different way, or to influence their emotions rather than their understanding? And this is something I feel very strongly about. So everyone's going to get interrogated on this. Okay, we've got the program is roughly this. We've got 4 main presentations from our invited speakers while it introduces as we go along. And they got 10 minutes each. The slides coming up there. Then there'll be some questions from the panel, and the panel is me and Tom Chivers from iNews over there, and Jen Rogers from, how do you pronounce the company? Faster. I thought it was Faster. Okay, and they will also, they're sitting over there, like judges on, Strictly or something like that. They're monitoring any questions coming in from the online audience, and then we'll be passing those over later. So then we're going to move into 6 in-person speakers. They're sitting here, and then 2 minutes each, and then 5 or 6, I think 5 now, online speakers, and who will be speaking. So what could possibly go wrong? So that's going to move quite quickly. They'll be open up with questions again, but then there will be a Q&A from the floor. So the microphone will go around if you can ask questions of any of the panel, and also online questions there. So, as I said, and that's all finished by 5, whatever. So it's going to be, I'm going to have to try to share this quite strongly. Okay, so, first of all, sorry, sorry, mate, there isn't a fire alarm test scheduled. If you hear the fire alarm, please evacuate. Always sounds a bit rude, that, doesn't it? Anyway, yes, I would certainly do that. Sorry, cut that bit from the recording. Your nearest exits are the main entrance you came in through and the doors behind you. Okay, fine. So now we will move. Sorry. Now we'll move on to the main speakers. I'm really pleased to introduce John Burn-Murdoch from the Financial Times, who has 10 minutes starting from now.
Excellent. Thanks, David. And yeah, thanks to everyone for coming here. It's nice to do these things in person. So yeah, I'm going to take three of the bullet points that David just outlined there to go through a couple of minutes on each, on how I see them having been done. The first of those is communicating uncertainty. This is obviously a really interesting one because this is, I think as all of us who've been watching the pandemic or let alone working on it, know there's a huge amount of uncertainty around all of the numbers we've been seeing and hearing every day, and certainly around what they mean. I want to start by, well, as a representative of the media, I should look at how we've done. So I wanted to just give one example, which was from December last year. So when Omicron was among us and numbers were rising. And this is just a selection of some snippets from stories from a variety of media. I've taken them all. I've reformatted the text so we can't see who was who. But all talking about this horrible worst case scenario of a potential 5,000 deaths a day at the peak of an Omicron wave. And then I just want to show you what the SPI-M report was actually saying at the same time that those articles were written, which was that the peak could be somewhere between 600 to 6,000 deaths a day. So I just think that's an interesting example of how there's often a tendency in the media, and I'm saying this not only as an observer, but as someone who's in these discussions with editors and that kind of thing. There's often a tendency for us in the media to say, what's the number, what's the one number, and to home in on that number. So I think the detriment of everyone's understanding of how much uncertainty there is in this space. The modelers themselves were, in fact, thanks in no small part to Fraser Nelson and Kurt, the Spectator, were under a lot of scrutiny. I think the modelers did a reasonably good job at conveying uncertainty. This is just one snapshot, again, from the start of the Omicron wave. This was Warwick's projections for daily deaths. And what you've got there is 4 different estimates of severity and 3 different levels of changes in behaviour, all plotted in a way that, for anyone looking at that page, you can get an enormous amount of information from that. They've also, in terms of transparency, plotted the real data to that point in those black dots. So it's not only showing how much uncertainty there is across different situations, it's showing how much there is within situations, and it's showing how it compares to what was actually being observed at that time. And that then allowed places like the Spectator to sort of continue that sort of march for transparency and for accountability, and to plot reality against the model. And as you can see here in one of the scenarios that Warwick showed, yes, they still slightly overestimated the number of deaths that we saw from Omicron, but it wasn't a mile off. But, we had the data and the materials from the modelers in order to do those comparisons. And I think we should just remind ourselves that that was not the case in many countries at all. So I think the modelers actually did a reasonable job there in terms of conveying the uncertainty in all sorts of different domains. One thing I think it could have been interesting to do is something a bit more experimental. This is ignore the data. This is sort of random data, but an example of something called a hypothetical outcome plot, which is where you take a model and you actually sort of explicitly visualize that uncertainty by showing how the same model can produce all of these different trends and shapes of data. So I think a really good job was done, but it would be really interesting to see next pandemic if we get other approaches taken to try and more sort of viscerally demonstrate how there actually could be a lot of different things, different futures conveyed in the data. So that essentially is the gist of it. I think that the media, we could do a better job of communicating nuance and uncertainty. I think the modelers did reasonably well. I think also there's just a fundamental limit to how much we can communicate uncertainty, because almost by communicating numbers, you remove uncertainty. So I think that's just an interesting one philosophically. Next up, data visualization and how this was done. Starting with, to pick up on what David mentioned earlier, the dashboard. I think those people among us who haven't spent a huge amount of time looking at what other countries provide may not have realised just quite how exceptional the outputs of the dashboard have been in the UK. This is the heat map of cases by age over time, and the granularity of this data and how clearly it's communicated is absolutely world class. I can't think of many countries that have this data available at all, let alone communicated in, I think, such clear and striking ways. And that's just one tiny example. Another one, when the Delta wave landed, the dashboard by this time provided these age breakdowns, which this was a critical question at that time. It was, okay, cases are rising, but after the vaccination campaign, are they rising as quickly and as high among older people who've been vaccinated as younger people who haven't? And you were able to answer that question in situ on the dashboard. Again, I think it's not just about the quality of the output, it's about how there was a consistent, continuous reaction to what was the most key bit of information to be known at any given time, and that was delivered time and time again. And we have the famous government press conferences. Next slide, please, and such. I think, again, these came in from a mistake, but I think the fact that we had these press conferences, the fact that we had charts being presented to us every day, I think was something that certainly hasn't happened in all the way across the world. This is an example I picked as, I think, a really good example of visual communication. This was at a time when we had a new variant arriving. This was Alpha back in winter of 2020. The big question was, why are cases going up? What's going on? This chart essentially answered that by showing that we had two variants at play. You've got a narrative chart title, so even someone who doesn't instinctively understand line charts can see what's going on. I think that was just a good example, and it's also something that you can get in the sort of 10-20 seconds it would have been on screen. I think a less good example was something like this, where, again, I've just been singing the praises of heat maps for showing demographic differences, but the key there is that on the dashboard, you can spend a few minutes parsing it, whereas trying to cram something like this into 15 seconds or so of time on what for most people was a small screen was never really going to work. And also there's no narrative title. So for most people, even including sort of chart people like us, you look at that and you go, sorry, what? So I think actually broadly good, but there were some examples when it was a sort of kitchen sink approach, throw everything in and hope that the message is clear, whereas I think in his previous example, that was much more successful. And then the media and friends. I'm going to show a few examples. So this is one that we did at the FT in early March 2020. I'm showing a few examples here of use of the log scale. I'm sure Oliver will have plenty more to say on that, so I don't want to steal all of this stuff. But I think there was a general realization across not all the media, but a section of the media that people really taking the task of visual communication seriously and thinking, how should we be doing this? Not just thinking, let's chuck this data into one of our default bar chart, line chart templates, but thinking, what are we actually trying to communicate here and how can we do that clearly? And so this was an example from us at the FT. We've had the team at Our World in Data obviously doing this for an audience of tens of millions for 2 years on COVID, and of course on much beyond. And the number of times, I'm sure you must see, every time this is screenshotted, you're like, we're helping people. So I think in certain quarters, certainly there's just been really excellent data visualization to help people understand this, and millions of people would not have nearly the level of understanding of the pandemic they would do if it wasn't for data visualization. Just throwing an example from Oliver as well, hopefully not replicating any of your slides, but again, there were examples of some parts of the media, and the BBC done brilliant stuff as well, but some examples of where a sort of conservative tendency to say, we always do line charts like this, or we always do bar charts like this, so we're going to do it again. This sort of reluctance to show log scales, for example, maybe meant that readers, viewers, the audience had a less nuanced understanding of what was going on than they would have done otherwise. So I think those are all interesting examples. This brings me on to my favorite chart, the pandemic, which is Google search interest in the logarithmic scale, which really took off at the same time as these charts were proliferating. So, a lot of people were confused by the use of log scales, but you don't educate them by saying, okay, we won't do it anymore. You educate them by, as I think in particular as Oliver has done, by persisting and explaining and when walking people through it. And another example, just one that we did back when flu was much more mild than COVID, just use of animation and that kind of thing. And various other people have done animations, which I think have made really, really key parts of the pandemic really clear. So this was just showing how the number of people coming into ICU in winter 2020 far outstripped a normal year. So last but not least, the topic of misinformation. Was enough done to prevent misinformation? And I'm going to answer that relatively straightforwardly, which is that I think when you have a sort of notorious misinformer sharing your, official government documents as evidence of something that we know not to be true, that's probably a good sign that not enough was done to combat misinformation. And even the latest supposed solution to that still involves presenting information which is known to be misleading, and then putting footnotes underneath it, which, as anyone who's ever published a table or a chart knows, people don't read footnotes. But I think I should also be frank and say, like, hey, here's an example that I did and we did at the FT a couple of weeks ago, where I think there's interesting ethical questions. We published something, we did some analysis, we put something out there. We stand by everything we did. It's all statistically true, but do headlines and charts like this give ammunition to people who want to say that, oh, this is all fine and we can forget about it? So yeah, I think in some examples, very clearly not enough was done. In other examples, I think it's a grey area, and I think it's really interesting to discuss the extent to which we should show things that may even be sort of correct, but still have the potential to be misleading.
Thank you very much indeed. You may applaud. I think we're back to it's 2 years without clapping, people. Come on, even if you feel such a twit sitting at home clapping on your own. So thanks very much, John. That was great. Really good information. Can you please make notes of questions and things you want to interrogate people on later? Okay, now over to Hannah from Our World in Data. We've already seen an example of her work. And so I look forward to hear what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. John can't really call out other media sources because he seems biased, but I can and I will. So I'm Hannah Ritchie. I'm Head of Research at Our World in Data, and we are an online web publication where we try to communicate data and research on what we frame as the world's largest problems to a general audience. And we didn't, obviously, health is part of that, but it wasn't until 2020 when we realised, okay, maybe a global pandemic is one of the world's largest problems. So we had to do a very rapid pivot. And if you're not familiar with our work, you've probably still seen one of these types of charts floating around everywhere. So what we've done since February, March 2020 is we've published global data, updated every day on confirmed cases, confirmed deaths. We built a global testing data set, vaccinations, all of these metrics, and we give a very global perspective to make it very easy to be able to compare different countries and how they're doing. What that means is that we've really seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of reporting globally. It's important to say that things have got much, much better over time, but that's ranged from countries reporting via very clean APIs or very nicely putting it on GitHub, to the ugly, where countries still report vaccination data via YouTube videos, and we have to go in, pause the video, copy down the number, put it in our data set. So we've really seen this massive spectrum globally on how this has been done. What have we learned about data communication from this global perspective? I think there's a couple of core principles. One, make the definitions very clear. If anyone's listened to BBC more or less, Tim Harford's 75% of Tim Harford's job is asking, what is the metric and what does this actually mean? Like, what are we measuring? Pick the appropriate metrics. You can pretty much cherry pick any metric you want to tell the story that you want to tell. Make the data open and accessible. Keep it simple, first of all. Provide context and perspective, whether that's framing it in terms of other causes of death, whether that's framing it in a global perspective, but always providing some sort of context or perspective. And finally, being honest and transparent. And that goes both ways, both in terms of making it very clear how serious the situation is, but also being very, very clear that it's maybe not the end of the world. Like, it's providing this balance on both sides is very, very important. So I can't go through like all of these aspects, but just a couple to touch on. One is making definitions clear. So if we go back to February, March 2020, everyone's laughing because this is how ludicrous it was. So the government is very, very slow to act. What we've seen throughout the pandemic is even when different policies are not in place, what we've seen is that people still adapt their behaviours based on how they perceive the situation to be. The downside of this is that when the media reports that infections in the UK, there's 4 or 8 or 10, they do not take it seriously, they do not adapt behaviour, and that's obviously very normal. So very early on in the pandemic, we failed to communicate how serious it was because we did not make clear that confirmed cases are not the same as infections, and we also just we just struggle as humans to perceive non-linear growth. So we failed on both of those counts, I would say. Our reaction to that was to put confirmed in absolutely every single chart, make these, and I think to the point of annoying some people, like, yeah, just give me the data. But I think these definitions are so key to understanding what's going on. We also built this global testing database to give some sense of perspective to cases. We would think that's bad in 2020, but it's still the case today that most news outlets still report the global death toll as 6 million and 480 million cases. We know that the death toll is possibly 2 to 3 times higher, and it's certainly not 480 million cases. This is The Guardian. We've been in touch with them several times to say, like, this is not a great way of presenting data. They still do it. This is the BBC. I don't know why they've stacked cases on top of deaths. That's also like a pretty bad data example. And I think we can question like who's to blame here. I wouldn't put blame on it, but I think a really key part of this is that the World Health Organization should have been very, very early on making sure that we had some sense of excess mortality figures. We had a call with them in spring 2020 where we said, especially looking at the global situation where it looked like poor countries just weren't being hit at all, we were like, how do we somehow get some sort of proper perspective on this? And they said, yes, definitely. We're getting on the excess mortality data. 2 years on, still zero from them. And this is their dashboard where they still present 6 million deaths. So we're actually relying mainly on The Economist, a newspaper, to tell us that gives some sense of perspective on the situation. If we go back to the UK definitions of what is a COVID death, we've seen over time that it's shifted over time, especially in England, in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. It was a bit more constant, but we've shifted from registration on death certificate, anyone with a positive test, and then we had this time restricted 28-day within a positive test. I think it's fine to shift definitions over time, especially if we think that it improves the measure or improves understanding of the measure. But there are often these really common counter arguments to this. So the most common one I hear is, yeah, people have died, but it's based on this test number, like most people are getting hit by a bus. I don't know why everyone seems to think that everyone's getting hit by a bus. But that's, I mean, you have the data that very clearly shows that's not true, especially in 2020. Nearly everyone with on their COVID on their death certificate had it as the key underlying cause of death. The UK just did not make this very clear, and I know still today talking to people that it hasn't been made clear. And the point is, if you do not give people a number, they can make up any number they want and propagate that number. Another key argument is, well, okay, people are dying from COVID, but we're kind of just switching it from one cause to another. They would have died of something else anyway. Of course, there's another metric you can use to show that. This is excess mortality, which we see has just been much, much higher than the baseline we would expect in a given year. So it's not just the substitution, it's additional. This is not obviously also not a perfect metric of deaths. That has its downsides, but it makes very clear that this statement is also not true. So there's not a perfect definition, but combining the different measures, we can fight against some of the stuff that's been propagated. Like, it's not just the flu. It's not that we're just shifting deaths from one cause to another. And most people with COVID on their death certificate did have it as the underlying cause of death. Now, picking out appropriate metrics, the recognition that cases, you could kind of manipulate cases based on your testing, kind of turned into this kind of PR contest globally. One extreme, so the leader of Tanzania in June 2020 just said, we've prayed and COVID's gone. Actually, really tragically, last year he died, I think probably from COVID. And basically, for more than a year, Tanzania reported 0 cases, which makes it very clear that when you're showing a map of cases and media puts which countries are being hardest hit, and Tanzania shows up with 0, like, that's obviously very, very wrong. The flip side of this is that we had, and Donald Trump is holding an award and data chart there, which was not our proudest moment. Is the flip side of saying we only have high cases in the US. It's not a big outbreak. It's just because we just test loads and loads and loads. We also had that in Europe. So Boris got involved and said we're testing more than any country in Europe. We are the leader in this. again, that's a very inappropriate use of total tests. It's not an... So the comparison that was made often at the time was, okay, we're doing better than Germany because we're testing more. Like, that's a very inappropriate metric to base that on. The bigger the side of the outbreak, the less control you have over the outbreak, the more tests you need. So a more appropriate metric there would be test positivity. Another key thing on metrics is, and the UK government dashboard now does this very, very well, is avoiding static snapshots. There's obviously clear reasons for this, but if infectious disease, given 1 day of data is basically useless. Rolling averages, we need those because of weekend effects, different methodological changes, and differences between specimen and reported data are very key. On the front of making data open and accessible, this was a publication by Edouard Mathieu and our team, basically making the point that dashboards can be nice, and I'm caveating this because I think the UK government dashboard, as John said, is probably the best in the world. It's actually managed to combine making data available and providing the dashboard with it. But most countries are really, really bad at this. And actually, the key is to make the data open and accessible and free for everyone, because there are a bunch of nerds here that will make the charts for you and do the communication for you. We can't do that if there's zero data. Some of the metrics that we didn't have, or we did have, but were not easily accessible: hospitalizations for or with COVID. That's very just key question that people have because of COVID or with COVID. We're now getting more data breakdowns by age, but this is a kind of relatively recent thing, and deaths by vaccination status. So we have these charts for a couple of countries that make this data very open and accessible for us. England, we did have it for a while. We discontinued it because it wasn't very the file wasn't very stable. It was just basically a pain. And the point is, you need to make it very, very easy for people to use this. But I think basic charts like this are really, really key in communication, and the data needs to be there. So I think my key message is you need to provide people with the data they need to answer the basic questions that they have, and they have a right to answers to those questions. Communicate effectively, or if you don't, someone will fill that information vacuum for you, and you get examples like this. Thank you.
Hannah, thank you so much. You've got an extraordinary amount of material there, so save up your comments and questions, because there's there's some great stuff there. And if this is Toby Young's idea of arithmetic, you can leave that as an exercise for the reader to show how wrong he is. Okay, so Oliver's had some good plugs already. So this is Oliver Johnson, who I could refer to as an independent analyst, as an academic who's been a very strong presence on Twitter, which is where I've got to know him. And so the way he's taking the role of others like James Ward and Paul Mainwood and others who have been, I think, doing a fantastic job on Twitter at putting out information. So,
okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. This is a great meeting already. So, I think overall we've done a good job. I think we shouldn't forget that. I think we should, collectively as a community, we give ourselves a pat on the back. But I want to talk about some ways that I think we could have done better. I've got a few examples of where I think we could have done better. What I'd like to do is to kind of contrast the official response and, shall I say, the unofficial response, which I think I'm representing. So the official response, I think we've talked about a bit already. I kind of call this the grown-ups in the room. So the people at the press conferences, the media, things like, we've already said this, the dashboard, particularly having the API on the dashboard has been fantastic. Our World in Data, the variant reports that we get, they've all been fantastic. But the question is, could we have done better, and how? And so this is where I think I come in, or we come in. We have this community of, no other word but nerds. We have this community of COVID nerds who have worked in an extraordinary way using open tools, online sources, sometimes extraordinary sources, finding data in places you wouldn't believe was possible. Twitter has worked brilliantly for this. It's a natural platform because it allows you to give a very speedy commentary. It allows you to give a visual commentary. It allows you to post graphs that people can see. And so I think this has been a great success. So really what I'd like to think about is ways that that's been a success, and ways that we could kind of bring the spirit of that more into the official response, whether we can bring the grown-ups and the nerds more together in future. So where I want to start is, as you might guess, with log scale. So here is perhaps the most notorious slide of the entire pandemic. This is the slide from the 21st of September 2020, where the chief scientific officer stood up and said, well, if doubling occurred every 7 days, then by the 13th of October, we would be on 49,000 new cases. Now, it says this is not a projection. This is if doubling occurred. But to me, I look at that and that, I'm afraid, doesn't convince me. I know about exponential growth, but the blue things are very low at the bottom. All of a sudden, we suddenly go up in red. I want to believe it because I know it's a danger, but I could see how people are skeptical about that. It may remind you of something. There's a certain slide that gets comparison that gets made. And the problem is, and people have pointed this out quite rightly, this didn't happen. This is a graph from the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford, who plotted the projection. They actually extended here the projection further than strictly they should have done. As you can see, they're taking it up to past 100,000. But they plot the projection and they plot the true data, and you can see that it doesn't match up. Now, the danger with that is that therefore you say, okay, what a silly fuss, what a waste of time that was, stupid scientists, what do they know? But actually what you can see is that there was growth, but that if you get the growth rate wrong, if you project the growth rate wrongly, then it goes exponentially wrongly. So this is the danger of plotting things, for me, on linear scales. So how would I have done it? Okay, so here's my log scale remix. This is the log scale remix of the same plot. This is the data up to this point on a log scale. You can see that there is points are going up from the bottom left towards the top right. I have fitted a regression line in R that comes out with a doubling time of 12 and a bit days. So the official slide had 7 days, I have about 12 days. But to me, that's more convincing. You can see that the points are going up. You can see that they seem to be going up roughly linearly on a log scale. We know that this is exponential growth. So what happened? That's the real data. So I think if they'd stood up and they'd made that projection, not 50,000, but 20,000, and they'd said it based on a log scale, and then in the future days, people had plotted those points and seen that actually it was following the trend that the log scale had suggested, I think it would have been much more convincing. I think people would have been much more on board with it from the start. John mentioned this already, so maybe I'll skip over this. But yes, I think the same thing happened in the Delta wave. But the encouraging thing actually was that by a certain point in the Delta wave, it did finally happen that even places like the BBC were starting to get on board with these log scales, starting to present the data in that way, which I think is encouraging. So maybe that's a sign that a lesson has slightly been learned. So just to rehearse the arguments about this, often it doesn't matter. Often linear versus log doesn't matter. At the moment we're high up, it doesn't make much of a difference. But early on in a wave, it can be very valuable early warning. And I agree that they're not always very intuitive, but equally, I don't think all the biology is very intuitive. All of us have learnt the difference between an antigen and an antibody. I couldn't have told you that 2 years ago. We all now take that for granted. So I think that, we have the right to educate people. We have the right to tell people this is how things go. Okay, that was log scale. So another thing I want to talk about, lateral flows. I think this is an example where there's been a sort of statistical argument to some extent, and I think it's been maybe not our finest hour as a community. I think maybe there's been a lot more heat than light sometimes in this discussion. I think particularly because some of the jargon hasn't helped. I think if you went out on the streets now and asked the first person you saw, what's the difference between specificity and sensitivity, I'll bet you good money they couldn't tell you the difference. But people do, I think, on some intuitive level understand testing. And I think the right metric here, at least for red light testing, is this positive predictive value. So, for example, this was a report from The Guardian mid-April last year saying that between as few as 2 to 10% of positive results may actually be accurate. I think that's a metric that you can get on board with, the idea that if I test positive, is that a true value? Is it a true result? Now, I'm sorry, I've got an equation coming up, but it's Bayes' theorem, so it's okay. But what I want to do is I want to just kind of calibrate this a bit. So what they're saying is 2% to 10%. So in the odds world, that's kind of 0.02 to 0.11. So I want to see whether that's realistic. So here is Bayes' theorem. This is the odds formulation of Bayes' theorem, which more or less says that the odds of being infected given a positive test is the product of three things. It's the prevalence times the true positive rate divided by the false positive rate. So this is a formula we can all agree on. The only question is what numbers you plug in. So for example, if you plug in the numbers that were in the Guardian report, if you say that the prevalence is 0.02, the true positive rate is 50%, the false positive rate is 0.3, you do get the odds that they claim. It's not that they did the calculation wrong, that if you plug in those numbers, you will get that value. The question is really, are those numbers realistic? And so this is where some of this kind of COVID nerdery with people on their time on their hands came in. I realised that the Scottish government were publishing a report every week which had the number of lateral flow tests and the number of positive lateral flow tests. And so what I realised was that actually from this you could get an upper bound on the false positive rate. Even if every single positive test in Orkney and Shetland was a false positive, then that gave you an upper bound on what the false positive rate was. It gave you an upper bound on about 0.03%, not 0.3, 0.03%. So that's a big difference. It's a factor of 10 in the odds ratio. And then actually we got, around the same time, we got some real world confirmation. And I'm still not sure if the grown-ups realized what they were giving us here, but one day, in a Friday in April, they gave us lateral flow cancellation numbers. They told us, we're taking this number of tests off the dashboard, we're reducing the number of positive tests by 8,000. And so what this meant was that we could work out the proportion of positive tests that were correct. And so what we came out with was this figure, 82%. It wasn't 2%, it wasn't 10%, it was 82% of these tests were coming out correct. Now my slides, the numbers have slightly gone off this, but actually what it turns out is that this is very consistent with what you could get from Bayes' formula. If you plugged in the ONS prevalence at the time, which was about 0.3%, and this true positive rate and the false positive rate that we got from Scotland, then the odds turned out to be extraordinarily close to this kind of real world data that we were getting. And so I think it's an example. It wasn't a clinical trial. It wasn't beautifully reported. It was kind of nerds hacking away at metrics that weren't maybe even meant to be seen. But, there was a lot of stuff that we could do like this. So one more quick example of this. Having seen that lateral flow tests were working, or how well they were working, this actually gave us a way to diagnose the testing system. Because if you remember from Bayes' formula, if the true positive rates and the false positive rates stay the same, then essentially the odds are proportional to the prevalence. You fix two of the things, only one thing is varying. Now, what that means is if the positive predictive value is falling at a time when the prevalence is rising, then something is wrong. And that's where often, and I'm sure John and Hannah will say the same, that this is often where things start being interesting, is when you see something, hang on, there's something weird here. And this was an example. So there was a week where we went from 92.5% of lateral flow tests passing PCR confirmation to 87%. Now that doesn't seem much, but that's because you're not necessarily thinking in terms of odds. If you think in terms of odds, the odds have halved. That shouldn't have happened. And so this is a question I'd like to ask. What is the point of all of this data? If we don't actually act on it, if we've got all this data and we don't have KPIs for it, that we don't say, actually, we're plotting these numbers and this has gone off a cliff and this shouldn't have happened, then, why were we doing it? Why were we putting these numbers out there? And so here we are. This was what turned out to be the Immensa thing that you can see I've highlighted in red, that the number of non-matched PCR tests actually doubled in a week. And that was the first sign in this public data that this Immensa problem was happening. So this was the 9th of October. The lab got shut down shortly after. But the thing that's really interesting is that actually COVID nerds on Twitter, and I'm sure people won't be offended for me calling them nerds, had seen this a month ago. Here is a graph that Dave plotted on Twitter on the 9th of September, the 10th of September. And here is a graph that has the Immensa postcodes pretty much plotted out for you. This was Dave plotting a daily ratio of cases one day to the cases the day before. All of a sudden, there's this big green region in the southwest where test positivity had gone off a cliff. So I think the question is, what do we do about that? If people on Twitter spot something that's standing out like that, what is the mechanism to feed that into the official reporting chain? I'm not saying that we shut down a lab because somebody on Twitter has plotted a graph, but to say that actually, look, we might want to take a look at this. This seems interesting. Okay, right, I'm out of time, but here are some final very quick thoughts. So I think we shouldn't be afraid to communicate using maths. We shouldn't be afraid to educate people. People have said this already, having segmented data is immensely valuable. And I think there are very interesting things in niche sources, that sources that you don't necessarily think of are often the places that the interesting things happen. So I'm going to stop there.
Great. Oliver, thanks. Our final contributing main speaker is Will Moy from Full Fact, who's got COVID. I mean, how dare he, really? There's a lot of it about, so we're now going to...
Yeah, we're going to share a video of him.
We're going to show a video,
Yeah.
share a video of Will. He's very kindly pre-recorded his 10 minutes, which should mean he keeps to time.
Sorry.
Yes. No, I should have shown you. Oh, great.
Wait a minute, I'm just going to make it bigger so you can see it on the screen. Okay, let me see it.
Hi, I'm Will. I'm representing Full Fact. The person who actually led a lot of our fact-checking response to the pandemic, though, is Claire Milne, our health lead, and for a lot of that time, acting editor. Claire's currently on parental leave, but what I'm going to say is based on her compilation of our lessons learned from the pandemic, as well as my own reflections. My starting point is that this should be a moment for celebration. At Full Fact, as elsewhere, this was not a carefully rehearsed response. Perhaps it should have been, given the pandemic was top of the National Risk Register. But the reality is that improvised extraordinary efforts in the teeth of personal and organisational challenges and abuse and threats, particularly targeted at women and people of colour, were what we all had to deal with. There are, of course, moments when we wish we'd done better, or others should wish they had done better. But that's what you'd expect under these circumstances. When I come to talk about lessons learned, I won't be dwelling on individual decisions or individual products. I'm going to be talking about the wider system. Let me start with what we call the reverse Swiss cheese model. Getting good information to people is actually an extremely implausible thing. Firstly, you have to ask the right questions and collect the right information. Then you have to analyze it well. Then you have to communicate those findings effectively. That has to reach people who can reach the right audience of decision makers, be that politicians or the public, and they have to be able to transmit that explanation effectively. And then finally, the audience has to understand it. And if any one of those steps goes wrong, then the eventual decision maker doesn't get to make their decision with good evidence. That's a huge challenge, and it takes teamwork to overcome it. And I think we should recognise just how far success has happened during the pandemic. When the vaccine came out in November 2020, half of people were confident that they would get a vaccine. By April, that was up to 2/3. Now, 9 out of 10 people have had at least one dose. Life-saving decisions based on rigorous evidence, and that's something to celebrate and which many of the people in this discussion have contributed to. But when you think about that journey from having good evidence to getting understanding, you can fail at any stage. And in the pandemic, we saw examples of failure at every stage. The care homes catastrophe, as at least one commentator called it, is a great example of failing at the earliest stage. There was no process to collect daily data from care providers. We did not know how many people were receiving care in the social care sector, and that cost lives. It was also a completely predictable problem. The Office for Statistics Regulation in 2018-19 said that statistics can only paint a partial picture of what actually happens to people, and there are limitations due to gaps in understanding of how those activities should be comprehensively recorded to allow for like comparisons. That cost lives. At the other end of the spectrum, getting people to actually act on good information sometimes means turning statistical evidence into 8 words. Stay at home, protect the NHS, saves lives. A survey showed that between late March and mid-May 2021, the proportion of adults who found the government's communications about what to do in response to coronavirus very or fairly clear dropped from 90% to 56%. That's when they got rid of the messaging urging people to stay home as opposed to stay alert. Some government messaging may be crude simplifications, but sometimes that is what's needed to turn data into actionable understanding. I'll give you a quick overview of Full Fact's contribution, just a fraction of the overall effort needed to make evidence useful for people during this pandemic. I'm looking forward to hearing about other people's perspectives on what happened. Full Fact, of course, is best known for our fact-checking. We wrote over 800 articles and fact checks during COVID-19 related to the pandemic. Vaccines, deaths, and testing were the most common topics for claims across all of our content. We are, if you like, first responders to information quality problems. We monitor the news, parliament, and social media. We work with a lot of the major internet companies. We also ran a service called Ask Full Fact, expecting to receive questions about strange cures and bogus claims. Curiously, in thousands of questions we were asked in March and April 2020, 4 out of 10 of them focused on what on earth did the government guidance mean. To give you a sense of scale, 20 million users came to our website in 2020 alone. Ofcom research found that 1 in 6 people who saw false and misleading information on coronavirus said they turned to fact checkers next to respond. And our fact checks embedded into Google search and Facebook and Instagram and YouTube search were seen hundreds of millions of times, providing people with information at the point of decision whether to see or share certain content. We also asked for hundreds of corrections in this time from media, from politicians and others. In general, the media, where we've worked hard in the past to establish better corrections processes, have been relatively good at correcting the record. In general, politicians who don't have effective correction systems, including in the House of Commons, have not. There are, of course, exceptions on both sides. So we do fact checking, we do corrections, then we look for the systemic lessons from what we've seen. Where does bad information come from, and how can we intervene more systematically to reduce its spread and impact? I'll give you just one case study of that. The yellow card system, which allows people to report adverse experiences after receiving a vaccine, it's a very important safety net. It's a statistics collection exercise that has suddenly become very famous. That database is available online. It's turned into statistics releases. And people have misunderstood something happening after receiving a vaccine as meaning something happening because of receiving the vaccine. To a frightening extent, we have seen this misunderstanding turned into adverts in local newspapers, misrepresenting the evidence as suggesting vaccines will kill you. That is not true. The Advertising Standards Authority has required those adverts to be withdrawn. We've seen it quoted by MPs in Parliament, and we've seen it carried in banners on the streets. Reminder that most people, the vast majority of people, have chosen to have vaccines. But it's a powerful example of how something that started life as a statistics collection exercise that probably never thought that it would be the center of public debate suddenly got turned into ammunition for people on different sides of an argument. The MHRA gradually, slowly, but eventually has updated the messaging around yellow card to stress what it does and doesn't do. In general, our public bodies have not been paying very much attention to how what they are communicating can be misused and the urgency of responding to that quickly. Because in our experience, when those kind of misuses get established, they become much harder to stamp out. So we've been working with a number of public bodies to try to persuade them to notice the early examples of their information being misused and then try to preempt that misuse. The second systemic intervention we did, which I think was important, was flagging to counter disinformation teams in government that when a vaccine was released, there would absolutely particularly be a surge of disinformation around it. So very early in 2010, we raised that with relevant government units. They convened the policy forum, civil society organizations and internet companies to discuss and prepare for that disinformation surge. And I do believe that that preparation, certainly not just due to Full Fact, but at least called for by us, was part of making sure that there was an effective response to vaccine disinformation when the moment came. So I want to offer 5 quick reflections on what we've learned from the pandemic. First, communicating reliable information is a team effort. Those teams where researchers and communicators collaborate to serve the public need to be funded. Research funders still don't get that. Secondly, statisticians are powerful and what we choose to measure matters. For all that, I think health statistics have in many ways been well communicated during the pandemic. We have failed to communicate migration statistics, the interconnectedness of the UK with the rest of the world and what that means for pandemic management. I don't think we've had anywhere near enough clarity on what's happened to the economy. 400,000 people have left the labour market, an absolute tragedy of broken dreams that I think has been under-discussed. And of course, the terrible sight of Ofqual damaging the life prospects of millions of young people through the exams mess. There are a lot of areas of statistics beyond health where I think there are much more fundamental questions we need to ask. Thirdly, we need to talk about listening. Communication, good communication starts with listening. The Ask Full Fact examples some of them quite heartbreaking, demonstrate just how much it's necessary to understand our audiences to communicate effectively with them. There are lots of audiences I think have been poorly served during the pandemic. Pregnant women. We worked with a charity called Pregnant Then Screwed to provide a bespoke helpline for pregnant women because so many have been left confused by the information that was being provided and rapidly changed. Black people with a lower take-up rate of vaccines were under-listened to and underserved by good information for too long. NHS staff do not have a high enough rate of take-up of vaccines. Again, that came as a huge shock, and I think there was a need to engage more with that audience. But the real missing audience, I think, in this pandemic is clinically extremely vulnerable people. And what I note about a lot of these audiences is they are not standard statistical breakdown categories. And so we start to see blind spots, and then we start to see bad real world results. So firstly, teams. Secondly, statistical choices matter. Thirdly, we need to listen to our audiences, not just talk to them. Fourthly, the way we do that is by bringing statistics and social research together, which we have not done adequately. And finally, I just want to flag one real risk. A lot of the pandemic communication response has been underpinned by censorship, by government asking internet companies to stop people in seeing and sharing certain content, all without a clear legal basis or democratic oversight. We should not underestimate how much the communications landscape has been influenced by control rather than persuasion. We should be very cautious about this, and we should be calling in the online safety bill for much clearer oversight of that kind of government power. So to close, I am proud to have been a small part of the work with the rest of Full Fact, alongside many partners to help save lives in this country and provide reassurance at a time of traumatic uncertainty. I want to thank everybody in the statistics world who's shown the life-saving power of open information and debate. I hope we can celebrate the great good that statisticians have done in this pandemic, but also resolve to fight to fill the data gaps of dangerous ignorance by listening more carefully to a wider range of people and making the case much more strongly for better information across the whole of public life. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, if you're listening, I hope you're out there somewhere. That was really good and very valuable indeed. I think there's so much there we can learn from. That's going to be incredibly valuable. Now, of course we're running a bit behind, so I don't want to take too long before we get on to the contributed speakers. But can I just, I'll just ask a couple of quick questions to me. What other countries have done well, do you think? Because can we have some specific names?
In reporting? Or?
Yes, in making the data available, because you've all emphasised hugely the value of actually having the stuff that can be downloaded by independent analysts, the nerds, God bless them. And so who's done that well?
I think to give the UK its credit, the UK probably started out as one of the worst in the world. Like at very beginning of the pandemic, the data reporting was very, very poor. It has now become one of the best. As I said, it's the combination of providing the data and making it accessible, plus the visualization in the dashboard. Like that's kind of a global phenomenon that we just haven't seen. I would say no other country has produced a really good dashboard that does both. In terms of just data reporting, I think the key for us has been, and it seems very basic, but just like having API or have it on GitHub, just have a stable file that updates daily. It's remarkable that that's so incredibly rare. Like some of the countries that come to mind is Chile or Malaysia, for example. Like often you would think that it would just automatically be the richest countries, like the US, for example, or countries in the EU, which would have the best reporting systems. Like that's just not the case. We run into like lots of surprises where, for example, Chile or Malaysia are kind of standouts because they basically just put it on GitHub.
Sure. I was going to give a shout to Ecuador as both a sort of initially bad, but then I think good example. And Hannah, I'm sure correct me if I get bits of this wrong, but the first time we at the FT really thought we've got to do this excess death stuff was when we had a freelance writer writing a story for us from, I don't know if it was Quito or another city in Ecuador, writing about how there were coffins piling up in the streets. And this was at a time when the official numbers from Ecuador were saying there was sort of a couple of deaths per day. And it was just glaringly clear that, the magnitude of their outbreak, particularly in terms of mortality, was not being correctly recorded. But it was then the Ecuadorian government that within about a month of that, or less than a month, I think, started publishing a sort of emergency bulletins of excess deaths. And, you know, again, initially these were sort of PDFs, or I think the first 3 or so were PDFs. But since then, for most of the last 2 years, Ecuador has been publishing all-cause mortality data in spreadsheet format. And you know, they clearly just spun this up out of nowhere because they realized there was a huge need to get this data out there, and they weren't going to be able to meet that, to sort of fill that gap using official reported deaths. So I think just an example of somewhere where there was a big failure of reporting initially, but the government responded. You know, other governments did the opposite, and places like Brazil have shut things down at various points. But I think Ecuador was a good example of a government that said, you know, we're not capable of counting this ourselves, so let's publish all-cause mortality data.
Excellent. Can I just, before we go on to the other speakers, can I just talk about another thing? Hannah, thank you so much for listing, you know, the data gaps where it could have solved a lot of misinformation just to have that data out there, because otherwise it's just a number to argue over. But we've had 2 identified problems where essentially official data has been presented in a way which is rife for use for misinformation. Will mentioned the yellow card system, and we've also got the UK Public Health England and UK Health Security Agency publishing data of cases and deaths by vaccine status, whereby using the wrong denominator, they essentially make things look worse in the vaccinated group than the unvaccinated group. And we got images of President Bolsonaro using that to claim that you know, the vaccines are killing people, giving them AIDS. Okay, I want some other bad examples. Can we have some other bad, because we're looking for bad stuff as well as good stuff, and I don't like to emphasize just the bad, but because we've heard so many good stories. Are there other examples where the way in which the official information has been presented has almost encouraged misinformation? Anyone's where you can think of that?
I think a key one for us, like at the very beginning of the pandemic, a big thing for us was trying to get to this question of like, what is the mortality risk? And there's different ways of measuring mortality risk. There's like the population-wide mortality rate, which is just the share of people in the population that die. There's the case fatality rate, where you take confirmed cases and divide by deaths. And then there's the infection fatality rate, which is arguably the metric we want. Like, if you get COVID, what is your risk of dying from it? The problem is that we just didn't have the data we needed to get the IFR, because we don't have the total number of cases, infections or cases, and we don't have the total number of deaths. And I think very early on we went with the CFR, so the case fatality rate. We calculated it, made it available for all countries, with trying to make very clear the caveats of this is based on confirmed, this is not the total number. But I think that was one metric where I think that was very, very rife for abuse. Because of one, it made it look like the mortality risk was much higher than it was, because it's based on confirmed numbers. And then also based on how countries report and their kind of testing, etc., you just get massive differences from what the case fatality rate looks like. And I think that was very, very rife for misinterpretation. That was, I think, a key one for me.
Thanks. Yeah. It's fine.
Well, I think the whole question as to how to compare countries is a fascinating one, and even I think you've said this a lot, whether to compare countries, because as Hannah's been pointing out, so many places have such different standards of reporting or of measuring, of collecting data. Countries where you know, the GDP is under $1,000 a day aren't going to be able to afford to PCR test their population in the same way that we can. So I think all of this we have to bear in mind, that we have to take it with a little pinch of salt sometimes in terms of, you know, trying to understand comparisons. I think we have to try, but we have to realise it's never going to be perfect.
Okay, we could come back to this later, because Will mentioned explicitly about preempting misinformation, knowing this was going to happen around the vaccines. What can be done to actually, I mean, as I said, nobody reads little caveats at the bottom. You know, I'd be interested, we could talk about this later, to what extent is it actually worthwhile not publishing some things that are going to be immediately misunderstood, or how can one control for that? Okay, we can think about that for a bit. But so now if we could move over to our contributed talks, if we're ready for that. Our first speaker, is that right?
Who's Will?
Oh, yes, yeah. Has Will got something to say? I do hope so. Will, Are you there? Okay. Sorry, I barged on time. So Simon's on first. If you can get yourself braced, let's wait. Have we got Will? Will, have you got any comments about preempting misinformation?
It's on mute. You're mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, David. And you can just shut the laptop when you want to shut me up. I think on the preempting misinformation side, and there are many examples of this. I mean, one of the classics is death reporting around weekends, where we've repeatedly seen people think because fewer deaths are reported on weekends, because practical matters, it sort of interrupts the trend and people can get the wrong end of a stick. Not publishing the data is not the way through that. Publishing the data with really clear warnings about what it does and doesn't tell you is the way through that. We've got to remember what decisions people are being asked to make. The public as a whole, all of us, are being asked to make fairly simple decisions about our behaviour, whether we get vaccines and that kind of thing. And we're serious about making them. We care about our own health and that of our family and friends. And if given good information, by and large, we will make good decisions. So putting very clear, this is what the data does mean, this is what the data doesn't mean, literally in that form if necessary, can be a good way of preempting things, but not publishing the data is not a way forward for all of the reasons Oliver was talking about in his presentation. The best way to good information in the long run is by getting information out there and allowing a debate and accepting that some people will be wrong some of the time, but presenting information in a way that helps people make decisions is crucial.
Thanks very much. I won't even shut the laptop. Thanks, Will. Please, I don't know how we know whether we'll work out a way of you signalling your contributions when we come on later. Okay, so Simon Briscoe, I'm sorry, I'm going to change the glasses. Okay, member of the RSS COVID-19 Task Force and Director of the Data Analysis Bureau. Simon.
Thank you very much. I mean, just to emphasise, I've got no skin in this game. I'm not employed by anyone working on this, and I get no money for it. So, just for clarity, I think to understand the communication of statistics, we have to be able to follow the flow from the producers of the data through to the disseminators of the data and how that actually gets to the end consumer. And we can't expect the producers and the intermediaries, if they are private sector or a charity or a think tank or other such body, to deliver comprehensive and balanced coverage, because it's not what's expected of them, it's not their role. Now, the four people on the top table today, and Will, are 5 very good examples of COVID heroes who have delivered that, but it's not their duty to do so. But I do wonder whether it should be the duty, and we should have expected public sector bodies to deliver. So what does this mean? So as far as the producers are concerned, I think what we needed to better understand this was some sort of hub where all relevant data could be put. We needed a single go-to place to find links to the key data and the reports. The ONS, PHE, NHS, academics, billions of extra pounds thrown to these organisations. But there was no central hub where someone like me could go and find the latest data on whatever was hitting the news that day or that week. Some organisations publish data, but generally they stuck to their own outputs. And I think this failure says something about the culture of secrecy, organisational politics and silos that still pervades much of the wider public sector. And I do think that the public deserved a little bit better. Secondly, what about the dissemination in the media? Very few publishers chose to publish data. Phenomenal performance by Spectator, the FT, The Economist and others, but these were generally shoestring operations over which we, the public, have no control and should not rely. But I would, in turn, look to the BBC. 22,000 staff, an annual budget of £5 billion, mission statement of acting in the public interest, provision of impartial, high-quality data, etc., etc. I think they could have done better than they did. So I hope what we've learned from this COVID pandemic is that when these crises strike, we need publicly funded bodies to deliver for the wider public. and most chose not to this time round. I think we should ask ourselves why. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Now I'd like to introduce Lisa Hadley, researcher at Cambridge University in infectious disease modelling, and she's representing colleagues from the Isaac Newton Institute infectious disease programme.
Thanks. I'll give some brief thoughts on uncertainty in the UK government COVID press conferences. So beginning with press conferences from September 2020, Oliver has mentioned the graph showing one example scenario where doubling occurred every day for a week. And as Ollie said, the CSA emphasised this was a scenario of what might happen and not a prediction, but it was widely misinterpreted in political and media debate. Those who specialise in evidence communication recognise that if one presents just a single scenario, as was done here, despite any caveats that are given, it will be misinterpreted often as a prediction. To avoid falling into this trap, in addition to what Ollie has suggested, one option is always to present two or more scenarios, together with the message that either could occur. To give further examples, I reviewed the press conference slides from the last 2 years. For plots displaying estimated parameters or modelling results, uncertainty is often included as a grey band around a central curve or with markings akin to a whisker plot. Unfortunately, though, the use of appropriate uncertainty descriptors was inconsistent. Many plots did label 95% confidence intervals, but unclear labelling such as margin of error or interval was sometimes used without indication of what error or interval had been plotted. See, for example, 31st October, 19th December 2020 slides. A consistent, clear approach to presenting uncertainty would have helped. It's also advisable when making forward projections to remove the central estimates and instead show only a range of expected values. This forces the reader to engage with the fact that uncertainty is present, rather than misinterpreting a central curve as definite. For press conference documentation, this improved significantly in late 2020 when statistical notes became a regular feature. However, these didn't initially include what level of uncertainty had been plotted, and the graphs themselves were occasionally missing uncertainty descriptors or used mixed terminology. Plots displaying concrete COVID-19 data were much stronger. Incomplete data was consistently shown in grey and clearly labelled. This was a strength and helped to communicate the uncertainty inherent in all timely data collection, which is now well understood. Finally, as well as the government, there is a responsibility for scientists. So as a novel method for communicating uncertainty, I would recommend looking at Nick Holloman's work on visual entropy. Thank you.
Tom Chivers from iNews. We'll fight his way past the tree out of the undergrowth.
Right, okay, so I'll just talk very quickly about why I think the media has got it wrong sometimes, since that's the thing I know a bit. But as John was talking about earlier on, there was a tendency throughout to sort of for us to focus on worst case scenarios, the 6,000 top range death, that sort of thing. But then we also made the opposite mistake. I remember early on in the pandemic, the media, large parts of us talked about, trying to do this wise sounding, don't panic stuff about, saying actually we should be worried about the flu, or actually, making fun of Silicon Valley people who didn't want to shake hands, or saying that it was only the only reason people were worried about the coronavirus was anti-Chinese racism and this sort of stuff. And it wasn't just that we always overestimated or panicked. It was also that we underestimated. And this is, I think, it's not because journalists are stupid or evil, and although we are quite often innumerate, it is because of a sort of fundamental incentive problem with journalism, which is that the incentives are not always to tell the truth or give the most. The incentive is at least partly to make sure people buy your newspapers and watch your TV programs, and that's just a really hard. The exception is places like the FT or the Economist, where people are making financial decisions off the back of the stuff they read, and whereas a lot of the time you're buying your newspapers for entertainment, they're incentivized to read these things. So when you are, so questions like, is that a big number, or what are we actually measuring, the sort of thing that we are supposed to be asking, they often get in the way of the simplicity of telling a good story. They make it harder for us to sort of to attract the attention that we need to do. And that then doesn't always make exciting copy. This is a really tricky problem to get around. It's one I've been thinking very hard about how you can solve. And it's not an easy one to solve, because there's no point in writing a perfectly true, brilliantly accurate story that literally no one reads because it's boring. These are genuinely competing incentives. I don't want to be too critical, because generally the British media has been pretty good. I've been recently looking at the Hong Kong story, and a lot of what's gone there is the Hong Kong media gigantically overstating, for the sake of a good headline, really, the risks of vaccines, and that has led to the disasters like the doctors. People are told to go and see their doctor to see if they're healthy enough to get a vaccine, and you end up with this upside down world where the least healthy, most at risk from COVID people are not getting vaccinated, and only the young healthy ones are. And we have been better than that. But I did want to just sort of say that this problem of the media getting, well, everything wrong sometimes, but numbers in particular and statistics is sort of fundamental. It's a fundamental incentive problem to how the media works, and I have absolutely no answer for how to fix it. I just thought I'd flag that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom, for asking whether we can be both trustworthy and interesting. So, Anthony Masters, who is RSS Statistical Ambassador and co-author of some book called COVID by Numbers with somebody else.
Yeah, I would say writing true but boring things tends to be my job on Medium. Yes, so uncertainty is an inherent part of statistics. In, I think, August 2020, the Government Statistical Service held a webinar on how to communicate uncertainty. They suggested 4 ways. So first, you describe the uncertainty, like this is a survey sample, and you kind of hope that people realise that a survey of 1,000 people won't give an exact, precise estimate of how many people are going to vote for a particular party, so on. You can describe the uncertainty through like giving a range or making an implicit statement. You can illustrate the uncertainty as you seen with like lots of data visualizations, or you can, as in Will's presentation, talking about the MRHA reports, tell people what they can and cannot do. Since we're looking at data visualization anyway, I thought I'd focus on that, given time limits. So looking at official sources, there are signs of good practice, but as Liza notes, somewhat inconsistent. One good example I saw was using a waffle chart to show vaccine effectiveness, using different hues to show the kind of lower and upper bound of the estimate. There are also, as we saw in John's presentation with the Warwick epigenetic modelling, ribbon ranges, with a central line and then a ribbon around that. You can see that the ribbons often overlap. So some observed values are consistent with multiple distinct scenarios. And then there are also lots and lots of error bars. Often you might see like thin spiky ones, or you might see these kind of thick arrays emanating from the central estimate. My view is that there needs to be better understanding of how people interpret this graphical uncertainty, as in do people understand what the graphs are showing them? Also, like sticks of Blackpool rock, uncertainty should be visible throughout the process, from scientists writing their papers to the works of sometimes innumerate journalists. And to top it all off, we need to think about what we want people to consider when they see numbers and graphs. So think about what stats mean, as in giving clear definitions, as in Hannah's presentation. Think about the underlying distributions, and very importantly, thinking about the uncertainty. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Then Roger Snow, Vice President for Statistical Research at the and consultancy at FASTAR, and regular COVID statistician for ITV.
Yeah, so I've probably got a little bit of a unique perspective in that I've talked a lot to, so I'd say the sort of numerate journalists and science media versus sort of more general media. And so I can kind of reflect on the sorts of questions that I've been asked by this more general media. And I think some of my main concerns have maybe been the lack of change in the way that data has been communicated, a lack of change in commentary as the pandemic has evolved. So, for example, just estimating the daily reported number of cases, is that statistic even meaningful when you think about the different testing regimens and things like that? And when I've been asked questions such as case rates are so much higher than they were 12 months ago, when I know that testing is completely different, I think it's been a communication issue there. Also, maybe perhaps mention, first of all, there are numerous commentators who have provided a narrative to aid public understanding and should be commended for that. But I don't think that all commentators have necessarily done this objectively, and a lot of the time they may have a bit of an agenda going. A lot of the time when people tell me who they follow on Twitter, they also say, oh, they sit on the doomsday end of the spectrum or the COVID doesn't exist end of the spectrum. And I think, again, it comes back to this change. The pandemic has evolved and the situation has evolved. And I think it was Tom said on one of our calls that a lot of these people have been sort of right by accident at some point during the pandemic. And I think maybe that openness to change is something that has been missed a lot of the time in the communication. And should we be saying everything should be done objectively, or should we be encouraging these debates where people sit at different ends of the spectrum, but also being conscious of the fact that we live in an era of echo chambers and people can choose the news that they see? Is that helpful or is it dangerous? And then I just want to finish by just saying there are sort of two things about the government's presentation of data that has disappointed me. Okay, one is, did we really need to have a daily update on how many people were taking a bus or driving their car during the first lockdown? I think it sometimes felt a little bit like data for data's sake. And as a statistician, when I'm turning the TV off when it gets to the stats, I think there's probably something wrong with the way that the statistics is being presented. But I do think there are a couple of big points where the government must be held accountable. I think they have occasionally had an agenda, and the way that they've presented data in a way that supports that agenda has been shameful. For example, when they were looking at COVID cases in schools, and I think not quite verbatim, they said they chose to present it as positivity rates rather than cases, but they could have presented it either way and it would have told the same story. It didn't, and they were really pushing an agenda. And then finally, to bring up that plot for the third time, I think, in this last hour or so, my issue really has been a lack of transparency on the modelling assumptions, and should we have had some sort of peer review of the assumptions that were going in there? You know, we had this. We had this one figure, and yes, we can talk about you know, the fact that they didn't communicate the uncertainty, but we didn't know, is this a best case scenario? Is it a most likely scenario? Is it the worst case scenario? And we had no idea of what the assumptions were that had gone into this. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. I'm glad we're raising the idea of smileys and frownies, because I think we should see about people with agendas. So, Kevin McConway, Emeritus Professor of Applied Statistics from Open University.
Thank you for having me. What I'll say has almost nothing to do with the Open University. They haven't paid me for 6 years. It builds on two different sets of pandemic experience. First of all, I spent a lot of time helping journalists understand the torrent of COVID statistics in various ways I haven't got time to tell you about. Second, I was one of two RSS nominees on an advisory group on data presentation for the Cabinet Office. So you can blame me. But the bad stuff was before that group. Okay, 2 minutes is about 5 tweets for no diagram, so I've only got time to make two unadorned points. So first I'll say I've been surprised to see how little many data analysts actually know about communication. I'm not saying everyone needs to be an expert in it, but there should be expertise in the organisation. ONS is usually not always excellent in this respect, as are some other organisations, but many others aren't. I haven't got time to name names. Second, transparency. It's admirable that the government decided to publish nearly all the papers from SAGE, minutes and so on. At least that's a lot better than keeping it all hidden. But there's transparency and there's intelligent transparency. Google it if you don't know about that. That says information should be accessible, comprehensible, usable, and accessible. Now, the SAGE document store is accessible enough in some senses anyway, at least you can find it. But for the public and for many journalists, it's not very usable, it's barely comprehensible, and so it's mostly not accessible. Now, in an emergency, the temptation is to get on with data collection, data analysis, modelling, and all that kind of thing. But if people can't truly make sense of what you're doing, you won't be trustworthy, so you won't be trusted. And if you have to start early with that as well, otherwise the mistrust will have begun and the misinformation will already have got in. Now, I'm not saying this should all have been done by the SAGE scientists themselves, but it should have been part of the system. And it should have been a part of the system without being subordinate to the government choosing the message. Inform, not persuade. That's a difficulty. Someone needed to explain what SAGE was doing and why. Someone should have explained the uncertainties, as has been said. Now, a bit did happen in relation to SAGE, but it was too little, too late. I shouldn't just pick out SAGE on this. I picked it because everyone knows about it. It's only one example. Several other bodies, or several other things that other bodies did, weren't any better. Well, it's too late to fix this now for COVID, but there will be other emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, now, if we're going to get on to online ones, if we can make this work. First is Christina Pargel, who's a member of Independent SAGE and the director of UCL's Clinical Operation Research Group. Christina, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Super.
Hi. Right. So thank you for the really interesting session. I think I just want to talk about the context for 2 minutes. So I think the public have undoubtedly got better at understanding graphs, not least because of the efforts of many of the people on the panel. But I also think the data still do not speak for themselves, even with the best charts. And there is always going to be vital context that needs to be understood. So, you know, a really basic level that's been an issue from the very beginning of the pandemic, it's understanding and communicating the lags between infections, reported cases, admissions, and deaths. And the most egregious is not using, you know, is using deaths as a leading indicator, which some people have done, which I think is entirely wrong. But there's also the kind of softer context of how all of those indicators change with availability of testing, differential vaccination rates, different cases in different age groups, and all of those things have to be kind of understood when you're looking at the headline figures. A really important example that we're seeing play out right now for the fourth time in the pandemic as BA2 has taken over from BA1 is this new variant issue. And that's where you get a situation where overall cases can be declining or flat, even after a new variant has started exponential growth. And then to concentrate on overall cases and kind of saying things are going in the right direction can give you a totally false perspective on the state of the pandemic and what might happen within a few weeks. So I think you absolutely then have to do things like separate out by variant. And this is quite worrying right now, just as we're doing a lot less real-time identification of cases and a lot less sequencing of cases as we're moving away from PCRs. And finally, just the context of what we're not measuring, what's not on the daily dashboard. So really obvious things are things like long COVID and longer term outcomes of COVID, but also social impacts of both COVID and the measures to control it. And that kind of risks not factoring into policy making because it's not one of those key outcomes that we're used to. So kind of just to finish, like my plea is always try and show people the context as much as you can or describe it, and then also remind people what's missing from the charts that we present.
Christina, thank you so much. I really like that message of explaining what isn't there. Okay, our next contribution is from, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, I'm sure, Matos Medo, who's a data scientist at the Department of Clinical Research at the University of Bern. Are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad that I can share some thoughts on the issue of preventing information becoming misinformation. And I will focus on the role of scientific papers, which haven't been discussed much until now. So my direct experience with this issue was after Science has published a paper on the impact of population-wide antigen testing in Slovakia. And with some colleagues, we identified important methodological problems and modeling issues in this paper. We disagreed with conclusions. After we wrote a scientific comment or the technical comment on this paper, it was rejected by Science, and only later we learned that Science has decided to publish no technical comments on COVID-related papers to speed up publishing, as they said. Right? So it was possible to comment any other topic except for COVID. Another example is that of the European Journal of Epidemiology, where there has been a paper published claiming that COVID incidence is unrelated to vaccination levels in the US. Again, several researchers became aware, and finally they managed to publish some comments in this case, and these comments have been eventually published along with the original article on the journal's website. However, It took almost 3 months for this to happen, and by that time, the original article has been accessed 2 million times, clearly indicating the huge impact it managed to make on the broad public in the meantime. So these two examples, I believe, show that poor peer review in combination with traditionally slow editorial mechanisms in science have directly led to scientific papers published by prestigious journals becoming directly sources of misinformation for a broad general public. The obvious question is how to address this problem, and I admit this is not easy, but one thing one can contemplate is to introduce a quarantine for scientific papers, for example. Thank you.
Thank you so much for raising the absolutely vital issue of scientific publications, and that this is not just restricted to the the huge growth in preprints being circulated, but also supposedly peer-reviewed papers being introduced without adequate controls. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, our next contribution is from Ting Li Su, who's a lecturer in oral health statistics from University of Manchester.
Hello. Thank you. I would like to contribute my discussion today on the long COVID statistics, as my 11-year-old boy and myself are suffering from 9 months of long COVID already. And then the first thing is, for long COVID statistics, I think it should be regularly highlighted and reported while communicating the risk of COVID to the public. And then because at the moment, the most cited number we saw on the media or on the dashboard is the mortality and hospitalization, which didn't give the whole picture of the COVID impact on either individual or the whole society. For example, you can argue that death sometimes cannot be the worst scenario, especially for the the impact on children who cause them the long-term disability due to long COVID. And then secondly, the long COVID burden on the society is completely being ignored. And also the current impression general public receive from the government or the media is COVID is mild among children and result in very little death. This actually provide a false sense of security for the parents that COVID can be ignored, especially for children. My second point is long COVID statistics is actually seriously lacking and also not very accurately measured yet. For example, the severity of the disease at the acute phase is not directly linked to developing into the long COVID or not. And then also the relationship between the vaccination and developing into long COVID, either vaccinate to avoid long COVID or how many will develop into long COVID after vaccination. This kind of data needs to be established, not only the mortality and death in terms of the vaccine can avoid. And the next one is the prevalence of the long COVID in children or in adult. And this data is still very unclear. I have seen so many data, and then the prevalence can vary from 1 in 40 to 1 in 4. And it seems like it's what is the denominator being used? Is it the whole children in as a whole, or is it only among those who are being infected? So it needs to be clearly stated when it be reported. And then the next thing is, I think when the long COVID data being reported, perhaps to produce the actually number will be better than the percentage, because the percentage may downplay the problem it actually mean. And then my last point is, when investigate this long COVID problem, we need to develop long COVID after the first infection or being reinfected, because nowadays there are so many children or adults being infected and reinfected. So when we look into the data, we also need to consider this infected and reinfected issue. So just to recap, I think the long COVID should be considered seriously and urgently, and also it needed to be added to the reporting metrics. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, thank you for reminding us of that. And well, I'd like to pass on to Jonathan Smith Renshaw, who's from Jonathan Smith Renshaw and Associates Limited. Are you there, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Smith Renshaw, and I'm going to discuss point 6 on misinformation. I've got 2 points where I believe more could be done, and a thought for the future where misinformation could have very serious consequences. My first point is the reporting of cases without reference to the number of tests undertaken. This is misleading, as the sample size is a key piece of information in any analysis, and even as stated earlier, Donald Trump knew this. So a case to test ratio is required, as modelling cases will be difficult. And this leads me to my second point on the use of models which were wildly wrong. And this has also been mentioned already. So models using misinformation were used to create more models of misinformation. In particular, I cite the models used to empty hospitals into care homes without proper controls, a model which resulted in tens of thousands of early deaths during the lockdown. Models for temporary laws and rules to manage COVID, which most people followed, but following Partygate will make future compliance difficult. And this leads me to my thought, which is the impact of prophylactic vaccines during a pandemic, which is still to be understood with respect to COVID. The consequences of the virus behaviour needs monitoring and timely management of facts. And I am worried that misinformation from past actions will harm the information we need to manage strains of COVID in the future. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And our final Ben Swallow, Statistics at University of Glasgow. Ben.
Thank you very much. Off by saying COVID-19 Response Consortium and also the Isaac Newton Infectious Dynamics of Pandemics Programme, and I'd very much like to acknowledge my co-authors and collaborators on those 2 projects in what I'm about to say. I'm going to focus particularly on the communication of uncertainty here, and the fact that uncertainty is often seen very much as a negative quantity, either as a lack of knowledge about a process of interest or the inability to estimate that with a degree of accuracy. But inherently, it also represents a very important quantity, which is the natural variability in the processes that we're trying to model. And portraying uncertainty as more than just an error, but also as an important quantity for inference and decision-making in its own right is a real challenge moving forward, and something that I think we really, as a community, should be encouraging and improving education on. Whilst, as previous speakers have said, the use of intervals, in addition to point estimates, is definitely a step forward. Full uncertainty quantification should mean more than just the population mean plus or minus standard error. Studying variability, particularly at increasingly high resolutions, and not just aggregating to both very low resolutions in space and time, but allowing for the variability across individuals, across spatial regions, and across temporal locations, as well as across variants, as one of the previous speakers said, allows us to gain much better understanding of what's really going on in the wider community. In signal processing, often the variation that actually determines the information rather than the general trend itself. And some of the work that I've been doing in collaboration with people such as Jasmina Panofsky-Griffiths at the University of Oxford, for example, is we've been looking at the variation in some of the important metrics of the state of the pandemic across different spatial resolutions. And that's really shown the important information that we can gain when we don't just aggregate to a single value and use the interval to try and represent that variability across what we're actually just integrating over. So I think there's a real challenge there, and it'd be interesting to hear any questions or comments on that later on. Thank you.
Ben, thank you very much indeed, and it's really good to remind us of the importance of variability and the fact that averages, are such a limited way of communicating, particularly in COVID, where often the average doesn't really reflect anyone's experience at all. given the huge variability. Okay, so so thank you very much for making the tech work and stuff. That was quite extraordinary. I couldn't believe that would happen, and thank you very much for the contributors for that. Now we're now open for discussion. So I'm going to ask our pair over there. First of all, Jen and Tom, have you got anything you want to ask the panel while everyone in the audience is just thinking of their questions? Because that was part of the deal, that you would get a chance to ask, make some points if you want to. I'm all right for the moment. Jen, did you have anything you want to say?
I'm not sure if this is one for this session. Maybe it's best for one of the other ones that we have. But I thought it was interesting when we saw the Warwick modelling and that did show uncertainty. But I guess there's a question of how easy is it for people to find that information versus what actually are we just seeing on a day-to-day basis? Are we expecting maybe too much of the general public to be able to go and find that information, and how much should actually the communication that they're seeing talk about this as well?
I think it's not remotely accessible enough. I think A, just in terms of finding it, but B, a lot of people would see just the page that paper sits on, and then the page itself, and go, man, there's like so much stuff here. This isn't for me. And I think this touches on a point that lots of the speakers have made as well, including Kevin. Like, this is all about communication. I think it's the common thread that runs through everything we've been saying. There's no point knowing what's going on. There's no point having all the statistics if people aren't seeing that. And I think this is also why, to Oliver's point about the nerds, it's not just being the nerds. It's the nerds who know how to communicate with people, who've risen to the top, as it were. And social media has almost been a sort of catalyst for all of that process. And I think the work that the modelers did was great, but it's completely inaccessible. And also, as much as I think they did a great job, the actual underlying data was pretty much never published. So at the FT, for example, we would have to go and sort of trace the lines off these charts in order to be able to plot them. So, and I get it, they were busy. That was like putting this in a GitHub repo or something is probably the next thing on their list that they just ran out of time to do. But I think making this stuff accessible and clearly understandable is just so critical. And I would hope that would be like the key takeaway from all of this.
Thanks very much indeed. And I'd like to echo Lisa's point again about people who've not putting in the central line even in order to stop the anchoring on that. So I think it's a very powerful idea. Okay, so now questions. Max, you've got a microphone. Now I'm going to make an appeal. This is not a time for speeches. These have to be short and sharp and targeted at the question. So we've got some hands at the back. We've got 3 hands up, so let's make sure we get all of those.
I'm Sarah Cole, I work for the ONS, and I've done the weekly death figures from the start of the pandemic. So I was interested to hear, like, a lot of people saying that we could have done more, which I do understand, but we've been publishing quite a lot of numbers. I'm specifically talking about deaths as my area of interest. We've been publishing a lot since the start of the pandemic, and I'm really proud of everything that the teams have managed to do. So I'd be interested to know how we could do more, because we were doing like 2 publications a week, and like I'm quite active on Twitter in trying to get people to understand these things, but I don't have the reach that a lot of you guys do. And when I tell people things, they go, well, that's not what the media is saying, so it doesn't matter. And so that's it.
Okay, just take all the 3 questions, and then but remember that, Sarah, thanks for your comment. How can people who actually work for the big agencies do that communication better? And I'd like to, of course, so I'm a non-exec for ONS, and so I'd like to really give them a plug for the fact that they do encourage people to have a media presence. Yeah.
So I'm Tony Day from the Campaign for Better Statistics. You might have heard of me. I've got 2 questions, please, Professor. Number 1 is concern with uncertainty. We've had a number of discussions about it, or mentioned. I think it's very, very important. But my point is, all data is uncertain. We don't actually know what the population of this country is at any time. My feeling is that just giving ranges of 95% confidence doesn't actually measure certainty or uncertainty at all. My problem is risk. What is the risk of the thing being wrong in relation to how you're using it? And I would appreciate any comments about that. And secondly, a matter of uncertainty, lady with the long COVID. One of the things that's concerned me all the time has been a lack of statistics on asymptomatic versus symptomatic. That was a key thing for the CIS. They are sort of there vaguely. And I appreciated finally how difficult it is to determine the actual symptoms themselves as to whether or not they are indicative in people's minds. And of course, to me, and this really is a question here, that's one of the problems with underlying long COVID. How do we know about it? What are the real symptoms that we can measure and say, this person suffers from long COVID, as opposed to fatigue or some other problem? Thank you.
Thanks very much. That is a real challenge. But let's remember the point that, in particular, the ones where the uncertainty, where it's important when it actually changes, when that uncertainty might change the basic interpretation of the data that you've got. Okay, another.
I'm Nigel Jacklin. I've worked with a number of groups who have felt that the measures imposed by the government did more harm than good. First question is, to what extent do you think that the case definition, which for COVID is very different to other diseases, has been important? And secondly, two of the speakers looked at the difference between projections and actuals. Will there be any form of review of how the projections compare to the actuals?
I do hope everyone's
accompaniment to it. And will my friends who had to burn their cows find out that they're not the only ones who've suffered?
Okay, so future calibration of projections against what actually happened. Next.
Oh yeah, sorry, it's like speaking of the Oscars, you get played off with music if you go on for too long. There are worse ways to get knocked out of the Oscars. So the panel, with regards to uncertainty.
Sorry, who are you?
My name is Robert. Please. Robert Cuff. I'm the statistician for the BBC. To push the conversation on uncertainty on a little bit more, if you've got a tenfold variation in uncertainty between 60 and 600 deaths, which is amazing and terrible, which changes your outcome, how do you communicate that? Because what the message is essentially like, what was the point of doing this in the first place? So that's one challenge. And the second one is, what are the barriers to getting the grown-ups, but who are nerds, out and communicating? So the people who work in the agencies, who are not the high-ups, who get the big outs, exactly, people like Claire, because Nick Strike did a great job early in the pandemic, but in government departments or in health agencies, out and communicating, because there seems to be a little lack there.
Okay, so those are very good points. Okay, can we do one? We're all going to start losing track, aren't we? But try to keep hold of these things as quick as go round. And then let's do one more, and then we'll try to answer something, I think. And I'll have to go to Tom and Jen and see what's come in online. Yeah.
Marcus from the ODS as well. I just wanted to address the COVID hub thing of data. I actually think that's incredibly hard to do because there's so many data sources. They all publish at different times. They all have different caveats. I think the more you put in one single space, the harder it is to present that in a good way. So I'm not sure there's a good solution to that, but it's interesting to know ideas.
Yeah, so I know there is the COVID ONS dashboard, and yeah, it is a challenge. Okay, can we have a go at answering it? Has anyone got any points on any of the things that have been raised?
You know, there's lots of things to talk about. First of all, I'm a huge fan of the ONS, absolutely, and of, like I say, the government bodies that have given us this stuff in general. The Friday prevalence is one of the highlights of my week when that comes out at lunchtime, and I get to add a little number on the graph. The excess deaths coming out Tuesday morning, again, fantastic. I don't know how to amplify that. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that some of the people from these acronym agencies have managed to sort of raise their profile on Twitter to an amazing extent. And I'm very grateful to them, because I think some of them have taken probably professional risks in that sense of doing that, of becoming the face of this agency. And I hope that places have got their backs, really, because, some of the things that they've had to put up with, they shouldn't have had to. And I could very much understand why people should choose not to. So I wonder whether there's a model. I mean, I've had the luxury that I have, in some sense, I'm independent in this. I have a job in a university, but I have a sort of plausible deniability in all of this. So whether there's a way that within these kind of agencies and these kind of organizations, whether you could have a sort of red team that's working to kind of, provide things that are semi-official, shall we say. That's where some of the interesting stuff is, but I don't know how that works in practice.
I think this is something we obviously we're going to have to address in our report, the fact that it's been seen as being so important that the people actually doing the work in the agencies do have a public profile, and the risks involved in doing that for personally and professionally, but yet how admirable they've been in their work, and to be really congratulated for their courage. Yeah. Are there any other points? We had multiple raising the idea of, what's an important uncertainty, one that might actually change people's perception. And also, I think a suggestion from Robert that if you really incorporated all the uncertainty in, for example, modelling, we've heard about modelling assumptions, if you really put all those in, you'd get such a huge range that would anyone consider that even helpful? If your uncertainty is so huge, what value is that? Anybody dare to answer that?
No, after you, Hannah.
Oh no, I wanted Will to say.
Go on, Will.
No.
Yeah.
The advantage of being honest about uncertainty is people can at least trust that answer. If you don't show uncertainty, people know you're lying to them. And so when you've got the 60 to 600, the answer is we don't know what's going to happen next. That's what we're afraid of. Actually, from the point of view of what decisions you make next, you're then left with we're either going to take the precaution or we're going to take the risk. And actually, that's a pretty simple story to tell. So I think sometimes when we're turning stats into public communication, we need to focus more on what is the decision we're trying to inform and less on how can we get the numbers across. And when you do that, it becomes easier to think about communicating the risk. And if I can just do a quick throwback to the previous question, the question from the ONS, I didn't catch your name, but I just want to be very, very clear. When people talk about we would have liked the ONS to do more or differently, we are absolutely not asking you and your colleagues and your team to have done more or differently. We are really grateful for what you've done. You and your colleagues have worked extremely hard. You've been extremely professional, and we are hugely grateful. The ONS is a £200 million organisation, and it's reasonable to ask how that money was spent, but it's not about saying to individuals, please work harder.
Certainly not. Yeah. Thanks very much. I think the point about the fact that showing huge uncertainty can be useful because it does change the way in which a decision would be made. It's no longer an idea of optimizing. It's a matter of a judgment, possibly precautionary. Although, Hannah, sorry, I butted in.
Just on that point, I think, as I said in my slides, I think the key point there is being honest, and part of sometimes being honest is saying what you don't know. And I think that's fine. I think the key of saying I don't know is that it also closes the gap for others, maybe with an agenda, to then jump in and claim that they do know because they have some data that no one else has. The point is there's been stages in the pandemic where nobody knows because nobody has the data. And I think just being honest and transparent about that is really key.
Thanks very much. Yes, yeah. Yes, please do.
So, I mean, it occurs to me with those sort of ranges, is part of it, if you've got some range of 60 to 600 or something like that, it feels like part of our job is explaining that tail risks are, that there exists this range of possibilities, and some of it's really bad, and it might only be a 10% chance of something really bad happening, but you wouldn't play Russian roulette at a 10% chance of dying, so you should pay attention to these tail risks. Is that part of what expressing uncertainty is like, is sort of showing what the bad outcomes are, realistic bad outcomes are, as well as just saying here is the broad range of possibilities?
Yeah, except as people have pointed out, it's not always clear about whether these are the bad outcomes or how they've been selected in terms of the scenarios being used. I think so.
I mean, we've said, I think 3 of us have now said about this slide with the 50,000 cases, but actually the other part of that was there was a prediction about deaths, and the prediction about deaths was under by they said 200, it was 400. So it hasn't always been a case that, silly old sage exaggerating again, which I think is the sort of narrative that's been allowed to build in certain quarters.
Could we see if is there anything online that you'd like to communicate to anybody?
There's a couple that I think are quite interesting. One of them, see if I can phrase it into a question, but it's talking about the excellent data that we have, and no matter how it's presented, sometimes we still get, for example, the education secretary saying he won't wear his mask because he's had his booster. How do we feel about behaviour speaking louder than data? And then there's quite an interesting question about, Do you have any thoughts on where the line is between responding to misinformation to correct them versus spending too much effort debunking them, that they're repeated everywhere and actually it can do more harm than good?
Will, have you got a comment on that last one?
Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, A, don't pick fights that aren't worth picking, and B, there is a way of correcting the record which is actually effective, which is you tell people that something is wrong, you tell people why it's wrong, you tell people what the accurate version of the story is. What you need to do is replace the story in somebody's head with a new story rather than just attach the idea that it's false to the existing story. So correcting the record is actually a skill. There's quite good research about how to do it. And if you follow that research, you can do it more effectively. But not everything needs to be amplified by major media outlets saying, have you heard this? It's wrong. Sometimes it's better to just leave it in the corner of the internet in which you found it. And that's part of the skill of kind of monitoring for misinformation and disinformation. One of the strategic goals of disinformation campaigns is to get mainstream media pickup. So there's a concept of strategic silence, which is used in that field about whether to pick up or not.
Just to quickly pick up on what Will's saying there, I think it's also critical, again, on the communication side. You need the person you're talking to, you're trying to persuade, to not see you as like an enemy. I think so often there's the temptation to be like, you idiot, and then you've immediately lost it. But you have to be like, oh, so I can see why you don't understand that. And you almost start from their view and their data points and gradually show them what's going on, rather than just saying, you thought that, it's actually this. So I think it's critical.
I find that so difficult. I just want to want to weigh in with this line. It's hopeless, it really is. So I don't think we can answer the question how you control a politician and saying something that off their own bat. I think that's beyond our pay grade at the moment. Are there anything else coming in from outside, and then we'll come back to the room?
The governance one?
Yeah.
So there were some people, a guy called Jeremy Hooper, who I have no idea who he is, but I'm sure he's very nice, asked, how do we improve the governance around the publication and use of statistics to enable effective decision making and communication with the public? What guidelines can we put in place to make this stuff better?
Oh, how can we best change the communication? Does that come under our remit? Yes, I suppose it does.
Anyway.
Right. Quick ideas. What we've heard about, empowering and encouraging and supporting people from agencies to help in the communication. We absolutely have issues about that. We know about the Office for Statistics Regulation and so on, which has been doing its best. Will, if you got anything on governance for improving communication?
Yeah.
From agencies.
Two forms of governance we need to look at. One is the governance of official statistics. It was talked about the need for official statisticians to be doing communication. That's currently much easier in the ONS than it is for statisticians in government departments, who are heavily having to navigate a relationship with the political masters of those departments. There is a case for changing the rules to guarantee the independence of statisticians when talking to the public. There are good examples of that already in existence, like crime statisticians leading press conferences on crime stats from within the Home Office. Those good examples need to be recognised by politicians and expanded. But the other area of the governance of communications is the Government Communications Service, with which the Government Statistics Service has to work closely, does not have anything like the same level of independent oversight as the GSS. We need an independent statutory oversight of the GCS to avoid it being politicised and to help preserve and protect the value of government communications to the public in situations like these.
Good luck. So, yes, I think we could agree with that. Now we're coming up to the end of our time. Are there any quick questions? Two quick questions from the room that have to be very quick, and then I'm going to try to wind up and go down the path.
Sheila Bird, I just wanted to make a point about institutional memory, because we've had a whole series of major pandemics, basically, over the last 40 years. And we've always known the need to be clear about the date when the sample was taken versus when the sample result was reported. And that gets forgotten every next time. We know the difference between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom in the timeliness of registration of deaths, and therefore the difference between deaths by the date of registration versus death by date of occurrence, forgotten and needs to be relearned every time. The publication of SAGE papers was one of the outcomes of the swine flu pandemic. Then it was conveniently forgotten for about 3-6 months this time around. So somehow, if we could sort out that institutional memory, so that certain basic statistical things just are, this is the playbook.
Thanks very much. A very, very important point that, and that must be something that we emphasise for future guidance. There's one quick one at the back there, and then I think I'm going to wind up.
Brian Gadala. I joined the General Economic Statistical Service in 1979, and I have an abiding memory of an introductory lecture by the late Sir John Boreham, who was the head of the GSS in those days, in which he said to all we newly minted assistant statisticians, he said, it doesn't matter how clever your numbers are. It doesn't matter how clever your modelling is. It's the words you put around them that matter. Because, and the point he was making, is that so many of our administrative and political class are, for want of a better word, functionally innumerate. And I wonder, how do we educate, first and foremostly, the administrators, and by inference, the politicians, to understand what upper bounds mean, what risk intervals mean, what confidence intervals mean. Because at the moment, if you present a politician with a very big number, he will feel obliged to act on it.
Thank you very much. And emphasising the fact that actual education is part of the communication that we are discussing. Okay, I'm going to wind this up now and thank everybody that we've gone through so much today. I hope everyone feels they've had a chance, or have heard, if they haven't said anything, had a chance to hear something that roughly represents their feelings. We haven't tried to come to a consensus at all, had huge numbers of very valuable points of view. I've got so many notes and lessons, but we've got a recording of all this, and we will be trying to distill this into essentially, the Royal Statistical Society contribution to the evidence for the inquiry. And I think we've got some fantastic material here to contribute to that, about the data that's provided, about the roles of the agencies, about what is there, what hasn't been there, and how the fact that certain data hasn't been there and some that has been there has been poorly presented, has actually actively encouraged misinformation, and so on. And so I'm really excited about trying to boil this down into what I hope will be quite which should be really quite a powerful summary of what statisticians and others feel about the communication that's gone on over the pandemic. And so with that, I'd really like to thank everybody here. I'd like to thank Tom and Jen for both contributing and monitoring the online questions. I'd like to thank our panel, Hannah, John, Oliver and Will for being there. And I hope, actually, Will, I didn't even ask, how are you feeling? You probably, we just assumed you'd be able to do this. You could have been really sick. I'm sorry.
All the better for seeing you, David. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'd really like to thank everyone in the room. What a joy it is to have a real audience to interact with, watch faces, for contributing your excellent questions and comments. And finally, everyone who's listening out there, for first of all, thank all our online and in-person brief speakers who managed to squeeze so much into such a small amount of time. I'd really like to thank you for that. Some great lessons there, and also for the online audience who have turned up. And I hope this has been valuable. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and see you down. For those, except you online, I'll see you down the end of the road. Okay. So thanks very much.